Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lewis Miller. The mission of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics is to enhance your physical and emotional well-being and encourage community. I say encourage community because I believe that living in community is the most effective and the healthiest way for us humans to live. I believe that most of us, in fact, most likely over 95% of us, are cooperative, collaborative people. We're tribal animals. We like doing things together, all kinds of things, whether it's a sewing circle or a poker game or watching a football game or watching movies, going to the theater. We love eating together. We really like being together. We're tribal that way. However, at the very same time, we must always be aware that there's a very small percentage of us that are very different. These people are dominators. They're predators. These are people who would have us be subjects rather than citizens. Look back in history where you go back to the pharaohs, where a few people at the top had 99% of the population in slavery. You can move forward in history. There were a couple of experiments with democracy and republic in Greece and in Rome, but of course, 1/3 of their population were slaves. And then finally, a couple of hundred years ago, we broke away. We rebelled against the greatest army and the greatest navy in the world, a little group of ragtag people in this place called America. And we rebelled against the king, and we won, and we turned ourselves from subjects. Subjects are people who, with the flick of a hand, could have their heads chopped off. We changed to citizens, democracy, one person, one vote, republic, everyone equal before the law. But it's a fragile thing because there are those, look out, through history, whether it's Napoleon, jumping ahead, Hitler, Mussolini, more modern, Bolsonaro, Trump. These are people who would have us be subjects again. We must be mindful. We must stay politically aware. I know these are hard times to stay politically aware, particularly since 60 to 70% of our country right now are living paycheck to paycheck and might be thinking, what's he saying about political aware? I'm trying to just keep food on the table. Well, what I'm saying is you have to stay politically aware even when you're struggling to put food on the table and pay the rent, because if we don't do so, we could lose our citizenship and become subjects again. In the words of one of my heroes, Thomas Jefferson, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Today, I have the distinct privilege of having a strong advocate for citizenship with freedom here on our program, Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. Dr. Ethan Nadelmann has been a policy thinker, a policy writer, and perhaps one of the strongest advocates in the country for sane policy reform. Let me give you just a drop of history. The Drug Policy Foundation was established in 1987 by Arnold Trebek and Kevin Zeese, and it was aimed to promote a more rational and compassionate approach to drug policy. Ethan Nadelmann founded the Linda Smith, boy, I'm stuttering today, the Linda Smith Foundation in 1994. And then in 2000, the two of them combined to form the Drug Policy Alliance, which has been a major force in the United States. We're going to hear more about that from Ethan himself. Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, Ethan.
Well, Richard, it's a pleasure to be on this with you. Thanks for inviting me.
So, shall we give a little history of the Drug Policy Alliance and what it stands for as a way of introducing our talk?
Sure, Richard. I mean, although I can say for me personally, my background in this area in advocacy and the writing and speaking really goes back to the late 1980s. I mean, it was the period at the height of the drug war in the late 1980s, and I had just finished a dissertation on the internationalization of drug enforcement, and I started teaching at Princeton. And I published an article in Foreign Policy magazine, a prestigious publication in early '88, basically saying the whole war on drugs is just it's essentially like alcohol prohibition, that the prohibition of drugs is doing more harms than drug abuse itself, that even though the answer may not be to legalize all drugs, we at least need to understand the extent to which prohibition was a fundamental part of the problem, and to look at other ways of dealing with drugs and controlling and regulating drugs grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. And so I started speaking out in the late '80s, got involved with the new Drug Policy Foundation that Arnold Treback and Kevin Zeese had started. And then in the early '90s, had the good fortune, I guess this is 31 years ago, to get a call on the blue from a guy named George Soros, who at that point was not very well known, but he was a very wealthy philanthropist who'd been and financier who had been focusing on Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And communism had fallen faster than anybody expected, and open societies were breaking out everywhere. And Soros was asking himself the question, well, I've always assumed America is the model of an open society. In which ways is it not? And one of the first things that hit him between the eyes was the war on drugs. So he invited me to lunch, and we hit it off. And one thing led to another. And I left Princeton, started the Linda Smith Center, named after Alfred Linda Smith, the first distinguished American academic to challenge conventional thinking about drug policy, and then built that up over 6 years as part of his foundation. And then in 2000, the Drug Policy Foundation had fallen on hard times. So we kind of absorbed that into Linda Smith Center and created the Drug Policy Alliance. And then I ran that, until 2017, until 6 years ago when I stepped down. But I think the key elements for your audience to appreciate about are this. The first one is that we focused on three major areas in our advocacy. About one-third of our work focused on ending cannabis prohibition. First with legalization of medical marijuana, then with reducing marijuana arrests and decriminalizing possession, and ultimately legally regulating cannabis for all adults. And that was the part that got the greatest amount of media attention. The second third of our work was ending the role of the war on drugs in mass incarceration. And that meant getting rid of mandatory minimum drug sentences, providing alternatives to incarceration, all of those things that were affecting America's becoming the biggest incarcerator in the world, and trying to roll back the drug war piece of it, which had really been the driving force of mass incarceration from the '80s until the aughts. And then the last third of our work was basically making a serious commitment to treating drug use and addiction as a health issue, not a criminal issue, which began with a focus on needle exchange programs and access to sterile syringes to reduce the spread of HIV/AIDS, and then expanded to overdose prevention, all sorts of things there, to teaching Americans about European-style cutting-edge approaches to dealing with drug use and addiction and street crime and all that, with the work around a sort of sex education model to drug education, the part that Marsha Rosenbaum pioneered with her Safety First program at Drug Policy Alliance. So those were the three big areas of work. And we did this with public education, sometimes with litigation and amicus briefs in the courts, and then most especially by working on legislative reform in state legislatures and occasionally Congress, and with the ballot initiatives, which began with a medical marijuana initiative in California in 1996. And, during my period, continued up through all these treatment instead of incarceration initiatives and asset forfeiture reform and, other sorts of things, and then culminated with the marijuana legalization initiative in California and other states in 2016. And over and above that, we devoted a lot of attention, not, maybe 10% internationally as well, to helping allies and advocates around the world advance drug policy reform in their own countries. So I'll pause there, but that gives you sort of an overview of the nature of the work, really since the late 1980s, when the war on drugs was at its most hysterical high.
You know, I came into the picture because I've been an advocate for the legalization of all substances based on what I believe is a constitutional right. You're a lawyer, you could give me your opinion on this. I believe it's a constitutional right to ingest what I want to ingest in the privacy of my own home, so long as I don't give it to or harm another human being. Is that one of my rights, Ethan?
Well, I mean, not if the Supreme Court doesn't say so. But in this way, I fundamentally agree with you, Richard. I mean, the way I've oftentimes framed it is that we think about what's most kept. I mean, probably one of the greatest things about this country that sort of kept us honest over our almost 250, 240 years of existence is the First Amendment. The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights and the protection of the freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly, right? And we know with each of those rights that they're pivotal. And they don't only protect elevated speech, they also protect the oftentimes despicable forms of speech, press, religion, or assembly, up to the point where you may directly hurt others, right? Our freedom of speech does not extend to the point of yelling fire in a crowded theater. Our freedom of press does not extend to libel, right? The freedom of religion does not extend to committing various forms of like human sacrifice or even certain types of animal sacrifice, right? And with assembly, not to assembling a mob. But it goes very far and it protects a lot. Now, to my mind, none of those freedoms make much sense unless you assume an underlying right of consciousness, a freedom of consciousness, right? And with that freedom of consciousness comes the freedom of consumption, the right to put into our own bodies what we see fit, so long as it's not resulting in direct, serious harms to other human beings. Now, the founding fathers could never have envisioned that there would be some threat to consciousness. They could have envisioned that a government might institute something like drug testing or other types of testing of our internal aspects of our being. So in that sense, I fundamentally agree with you that it is a fundamental human right. I do believe it should be recognized as a constitutional right. And one of the underlying objectives of my work and of this broader drug policy reform movement is that one day this right of consciousness, this right to consume what we see fit, including mind-altering substances, will be treated with the same regard as we finally come to accept the right of when it comes to our sexuality, right? In the same ways that homosexuality was eventually fully legalized by the Supreme Court after various state governments had already proceeded along that line, that should be, I think, and must be an ultimate objective of the drug policy reform movement.
I don't want to get too much into this because I want to stay with the drug policy reform, but there is an aspect of sexuality that is still illegal, which is the selling of pleasure. And there is something that really needs to be done about that, because that is a way of subordinating, subjugating women, because they sell pleasure and make money from it. And I'm sure if men could sell pleasure and make money from it in big numbers, this wouldn't be the case. But let's get back
Well, no, but Richard, just to say on that, I agree with you totally. And I think, there was one point when I was starting my center, the Linda Smith Center, where I thought we would take on those broader issues around the criminalization and regulation of sexual services and such. It is, of course, the principle is right. There are efforts in that direction, including, I think, the state of Vermont just passed some decriminalization of sex work. So there was a movement in this regard in the U.S. back in the 70s. It kind of disappeared at the end of the 20th century, early 21st century, but it is coming back. And interestingly, the fellow Rob Campia, who ran the Marijuana Policy Project for many years, once he stopped working there, he has moved he's created an organization. I can't remember the exact name of it now, but it aims towards the decriminalization of sex. Now, it is a complicated issue because even among the sex worker community and in the feminist community, there are very different ideas about whether or not this should be, like when we talk about legalizing marijuana, legalizing psychedelics, we're typically talking about legally regulating something. But there are big differences of opinion whether or not sexual work should even be legally regulated, right? Should the state play any role? When you look at the models of legalized sex work in Scandinavia, Europe, some other places, government plays all sorts of roles, that are designed to protect both the sex workers as well as their customers and to ensure safety and tax revenue. But some feel it should just be an utterly free market. Some feel it should not be regulated at all. So it's a complicated issue, but the principle is in fact very much the same. We're very much, you and I, on the same wavelength about both these issues.
The sex workers that I've interviewed favor decriminalization because they believe they will be safer when the police simply don't go after them than in a legal situation where they're going to have to be licensed and regulated. And then if they do something outside of the license, they're open to prosecution and so on. But
Well,
coming
it's
back,
hard to say because if you're decriminalized, it doesn't necessarily, if your activity you're engaging in is still illegal,
that's right.
and then you get victimized, it doesn't going to the police is not always an option. So that one of the arguments for legal regulation, whether you're talking about cannabis markets or sex work, is that people who are victimized have a legal right to go to the police and say
Yes.
they have been victimized. So it's tricky. There are no easy answers here, right? As we see with the evolution of cannabis legalization, and as we see whenever the debates spring up about decriminalizing or legalizing sex work.
Well, for me, the basic question is, if I do no harm to another person, do I have a right to sell my sexual services, my physical services, my brain services, whatever services I have to offer with no harm to another person? Am I allowed to sell myself? And that's what's being used as a way, as a hammer almost on these women, saying they don't have
Hmm.
a right to sell themselves. I don't
Right,
want to get
exactly,
yeah. Let's get
exactly,
back
and,
to
and
the
that's what's wrong. But go ahead. Let's get back to
yeah.
drugs.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
I came into this in two ways, Ethan. I came into it personally because I took LSD in 1965. I then took it again in 1967, and I recognized not only the great benefits that it did to me internally, but I saw its potential for psychotherapy, and I'm a clinician. I then was administered MDMA by my doctor while it was still legal, and I saw the great benefits of MDMA, particularly for couples therapy. And here the United States government is denying the right. So that's part of how I got originally involved. The other was the constitutional issue, which I mentioned, which is it's just I don't know what to call it, that we're not allowed to take and eat something that we want to eat in the privacy of our own home, regardless, of what the effect has. So I got involved, and that's when I eventually met you, and I met your advocate and colleague, Dr. Marsha Rosenbaum, who was working with the Drug Policy Alliance on the West Coast. The extent to which the government has been suppressive, if not repressive, has been overwhelming. It feels at times over these last 50 years like I'm not living in the country that I thought I was living in. It's almost beyond my comprehension, Ethan, how a government can suppress university level research for half a century. And that's what, as you well know more than anyone, has been going on. And then, as you've pointed out and taught us, and I have followed your lead and talked about, the policy has created the largest criminal organization on the planet, much bigger than alcohol prohibition created the mafia. The narco prohibition has created the narcotraficantes known as the cartels, and they're worldwide. And yet, the country continues these policies. Are we still living with the legacy of Harry Anslinger? I mean, where is this negativity about these substances, and where are these unusable policies, these actually policies that are creating crime? What's their origin? Who are the people behind this kind of? Are they profiting by keeping these drugs and substances illegal? Is that the reason they keep the laws this way?
Well, I mean, Richard, I'll tell you. I mean, I could go on for hours just answering the various elements of the question you just laid out
Please
there.
do.
I mean, yeah, well, not for hours here, but let's just let's say the following. I mean, you're obviously making many of the key arguments against the war on drugs and the prohibitionist approach to drugs, and those are the ones that I was laying out in the late '80s. Other people had laid them out even earlier. And there's no question, like it was like say it was like alcohol prohibition with Al Capone and organized crime and violence and corruption and all of that stuff times 10, times 100, right? And very much a global phenomenon. So, I mean, this was a kind of craziness that, I mean, on the one hand, it was particularly American in some sense. I've sometimes described the U.S. international drug control policy as an international projection of our own domestic psychosis, that we really were crazy about drugs. But the fact of the matter is, you had drug prohibitions all around the world, and some of them were, we were the driving force, the American government throughout the 20th century. and into the beginning of the 21st. But you had other countries with their own very fierce prohibitions about one drug or another. You can look at, I mean, obviously it wasn't just the Chinese with their opium wars and the reaction to all of that, but all sorts of countries would prohibit substances at various periods of time. So I think part of it has always been the fear about what happens with these substances, and some of that fear is about people, tuning in, turning on, and dropping out, becoming dissidents or deviants. Some of it is like the fear that people had around the popularization of the, say the printing press, of new ideas, of access to written materials. So a sense about, people, governments or people or rulers who want to keep control, or minorities who want to keep control, being fearful of that. Some of it, especially in the US, but many other countries, has been tied to race, so that those drugs which are linked with or perceived as being more commonly used or misused by ethnic or racial minorities are the ones that are more likely to be demonized and criminalized, whereas those substances that are more popular among the dominant elites or the dominant majority ethnic or religious or racial group, those ones are more likely to be accepted. So that's another element, that goes there. Part of it is that once you develop bureaucracies interested in enforcing these laws, they then begin to have an interest in perpetuating the laws that they enforce, and no longer thinking about the origins or the legitimacy or illegitimacy of the drugs they enforce. I was always struck in my early research in the 80s in interviewing drug enforcement agents and people involved in all aspects of the government's drug control policy, how profoundly ignorant they were, not just about the nature of many psychoactive drugs, but also about the origins of the drug prohibitionist laws. So you have all of those variables coming together, right? Now, I think it's important to understand that if you look in if I compare where we are now in 2023 to where we were in the late 1980s at the height of the drug war, there are some big differences. One is marijuana was part and parcel of the war on drugs back then, and now marijuana is, legalized in roughly half the states, producing huge amounts of tax revenue, hundreds of thousands, going on the way to millions of legal jobs, increasingly effectively regulated. I mean, with all the bumps and all the continuing black market stuff, it's a major, major transition. We've gone, when I got started in the late 80s, barely 25% of Americans wanted marijuana to be legal for adults, and barely 45, 50% for medical. Now you're talking about 70% of Americans believe marijuana should be legal for adults, 90% believe it should be legal for medicine. 38 states or whatever have legalized for medical, almost half the states have legalized for all adults. That is monumental, Richard. Nobody would have anticipated that would have happened just, 15 years ago. And you and I were
Except one
yeah.
person would have anticipated it, Abraham Lincoln, because he said
Well,
you can't fool all the people all the time. You can fool
yeah,
some of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, and even all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And the
the fact that he was right about, he also sometimes is giving there's a quote about the ills of alcohol prohibition that is attributed to him, but then there's a debate about whether he actually said it. But whether, a lot of this is about timing. And when I got going on this stuff as an advocate over 30 years ago, I thought we had a decent chance of legalizing, but I didn't know for sure. So that's been monumental. And then you and I were both at the at that extraordinary gathering about psychedelics in Denver that MAPS and Rick Doblin's organization MAPS organized, with 12,000 people showing up. And to see the rapid evolution of scientific research, one that is like what happened in the 60s, early 70s, but is really at a whole new level and a whole new level of legitimacy. And with
yes,
Oregon and Colorado passing these decriminalization initiatives in many localities. So that's really big. And then you see the ballot initiative in Oregon about introducing a Portugal style model of all drug decriminalization and shifting the resources towards drug treatment and harm reduction. And that was unforeseeable just a few years ago, and hopefully will be replicated elsewhere. And then you see the significant reduction in mandatory minimum drug sentences. You see the number of people getting incarcerated for drug sentences going down quite substantially from where it was 15, 20 years ago. So there's still a huge way to go. And the onset of fentanyl and fentanyl overdose crisis has obviously caused a lot of people to retreat back into some kind of drug war thinking. but we've come a substantial way from where we were. The basic prohibitionist edifice remains in place with drugs like heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and now illicitly, produced and sold fentanyl. But the fact that we peeled off some major portions and that public opinion has shifted in a big way, that harm reduction is now part of official national policy, right?
Yes,
That the
yes.
United States 12 years ago, basically stopped being the global leader of the drug war, of the global war on drugs. These are all significant advances that, underscore that progress can be made, but that we sure have a long way to go.
I want to comment on the progress that we've made on harm reduction because it's a story about Dr. Marsha Rosenbaum, the head of the Drug Policy Alliance on the West Coast. She was on my program in roughly 2005 on this very program, Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. And 10 minutes before we were about to go on the air, we got a call from my engineer said, Dr. Miller, there's a call from the White House. And I said, oh, come on, somebody's kidding around with you. And she said, no, it's a call from the White House. I said, get the phone number and call back. It must be crank. So she calls back, and sure enough, it's the White House. So I get on the phone and I say, well, how can I help you? Well, this is Dr. David Murray, and I'm here in the White House, and I hear you're having Dr. Marsha Rosenbaum on your program talking about something called needle exchange. And I said, well, I think she may be talking about that. She's an advocate of harm reduction. He said, well, I want to come on the program. And I said, well, sir, we're going on now in 7 minutes, and, we didn't know anything about this, and I'm really not prepared to take another guest. But if you want to call in during the program, you're most welcome to. Now, what's relevant about this story is that the White House was aware of both my program, this little tiny program in the middle of nowhere, and aware of Marsha's research and that she was coming on the program. How they even knew that is a mystery to me to this very day. But he was so opposed to this needle exchange, and the tone of voice he used when he said the words needle exchange as if, it was dancing with the devil, was fascinating to me. So
Yeah.
I don't know if
I mean, Richard, I'll tell you. I don't know. It may have been a fluke that they heard about it, but I mean, the fellow you're mentioning, David Murray, I mean, he was, of all the people who worked in the drug czar's office, many of whom I crossed paths with, some of whom I broke bread with over 30 years, he really stood out as being among the top two or three really bullies. I mean, really a kind of quite repulsive in many ways. There's one time I debated him, I can't remember, Chicago or whatever, and I just kicked his butt left, right, and center. I mean, the guy was supposed to come out to dinner afterwards and just bailed on the whole thing. There wasn't some of the guys you debate. Herb Kleber was a very influential, the first deputy drug czar, a right wing guy. I think he did a huge amount of harm with his opposition to harm reduction, medical marijuana. But nonetheless, you can still break bread with some of these people, right?
Uh-huh.
Others, like David Murray. I mean, there was another time he and I testified before Congress together. And this is a guy who would, pretend to be all about the evidence. And then when you just kind of scraped off the surface, the dishonesty that permeated out of him was really remarkable. That was also the point when John Walters in the early 2000s was the drug czar for President Bush.
Yes.
And he had been, I used to refer to him as William Bennett's mini-me. You and I will remember William Bennett was the first drug czar under the first President Bush, and John Walters was a kind of protege of him, and really a kind of sad sack. And but just another guy whose singular mission was trying to advance drug testing, to get drug testing accepted in schools all around America, something which he fortunately utterly failed in accomplishing, never had the guts to come out and publicly debate. And Murray was one of his clones on this sort of thing. So, I mean, in a way, I'm almost grateful that they were such outrageous, dishonest jerks, because there was the outrageousness of their claims, the opposition to harm reduction, the claims that there's no such thing as medical marijuana, all this sort of thing. I think they went so far, they were so outrageous that, the key people in the middle, the one line I've oftentimes used, Richard, to my allies is we don't win. Drug policy reform doesn't win until we persuade the ordinary American parent that our message is more persuasive than the other side's message, the drug war message.
Right.
And those guys were so outrageous in their messaging that it really made it easier and easier for us to persuade the center of the American public that we had the more persuasive message, that we were the ones grounded in science and evidence and compassion, not the status quo government drug warriors.
Hey everybody, it's Tommy D, the nonprofit sector connector, coming at you from my attic. Each week here on talkradio.nyc, I host the program Philanthropy in Focus. Nonprofits impact us each and every day, and it's my focus to help them amplify their message and tell their story. Listen each week at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time until 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on talkradio.nyc.
Were you an essential worker during the pandemic? If you needed to learn stages of epilepsy, did you depend on advocates? Did you use new innovations to cope with mental and neurological issues? Maintaining high quality of life and keeping good mental health are what we all strive for. I'm Frank R. Harrison, host of Frank About Health, and each week top healthcare influencers, professionals, and innovators answer these questions and more. Stay tuned on Thursdays at 5 p.m. on talkradio.nyc, and I will continue to be frank about health with all of you.
Are you a business owner? Do you want to be a business owner? Do you work with business owners? Hi, I'm Stephen Fry, your small and medium-sized business or SMB guy, and I'm the host of the new show, Always Friday. While I love to have fun on my show, we take those Friday feelings of freedom and clarity to discuss popular topics on the minds of SMBs today. Please join me and my various special guests on Friday at 11 a.m. on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Yeah. Are we continuing to make progress? You mentioned that 26 states have passed either recreational or medicinal
Well, no,
marijuana.
I think it's probably about 24 have legalized fully. Most recently, I think Minnesota. And so I mean, basically, I think over half all Americans now live in a state where marijuana is legal for adults.
And at the very same time, it's illegal federally, and if the feds want to, they can go into those 24 states and make arrests, and people are aware of that.
That is true. That is true. But the fact that you now have 70% public support, and that you now have, half the states fully legal, and then I think it's 38 states that have legalized marijuana for medical purposes. The fact is, the feds have that power, but they have not really been exercising that power now for many years. And even when Trump was in, and he put what was his name? Was it Jeff Sessions, the right-wing attorney general, in there? In the end, they made a lot of noise about rolling things backward, but they never really did. So the fact that so that it is still technically legal under federal law, and that creates problems for legally regulating this stuff. But I think if you ask why, remember, the feds are typically the last ones to change. With the repeal of alcohol prohibition, you had to have 3/4 of the states passing their own, repealing prohibition in their own states before Congress finally acted in 1919, right? That's first. Secondly, you have Republicans now in Congress who are not consistent with a substantial majority of Americans on a whole range of issues, but they have the political power to block things. And so you have key Republicans in the House of Representatives who don't want to move things forward. Thirdly, President Biden was among all the Democrats in the Democratic primary back in 2019-20, the least supportive of marijuana legalization. So you have a White House which has been very reluctant to lead and in any way be proactive on this issue. And so that's been a mild part of the problem. The bigger part of the problem, I think, is that you have, although the numbers are there, right? And if you could just put it to a straight floor vote in the House of Representatives and the Senate, you would get a majority for legalizing marijuana at the federal level right now. The problem is getting it through. The House is not a problem. That's already gone through the House. It's on the Senate side where you have 40 of the 50 Democrats who support legalizing marijuana, but 8 to 10 who are wishy-washy on the fence, including, your senator from California, Dianne Feinstein, who is just, been notoriously anti-marijuana. I mean, she would sign on to chair the opposition side on local ballots in California. And you have others as well. And then you have a handful of Republicans who support it, but they may be wary of breaking ranks with the leadership of McConnell, in the Senate. So, it's just the stickiness and the general incompetence of the U.S. Congress on many issues. That's really been the problem on the federal side.
Where do we stand moving forward towards decrim and/or legalization of psychedelic substances?
Well, I mean, the momentum's been amazing. Look, first of all, as I think was announced in Denver, it looks like a very good chance that MDMA is going to be approved first by the FDA and then the DEA, or then rescheduled by the DEA in the middle of next year. So that's going to open up, basically people, doctors, physicians, maybe others under their supervision, being allowed to prescribe and utilize MDMA, and not just for PTSD, which is what it will be approved for, but presumably other conditions as well. Because, as you know, right, off-label. So that's looking likely to happen. The big challenge on that front will be who will pay for it. Because the fear is that it's not that the drug is that expensive, it's that if you're going to provide it with counseling takes time. It takes hours. It takes hours not just during the session, but the prep and then the integration afterward. So the question is, can insurance companies, both private and public, be persuaded that this makes sense for them to do? And so I think more and more, efforts are being devoted to trying to ensure that the insurance companies will be ending up. So this won't just be limited to a form of therapy for more affluent people. It looks like psilocybin may also be approved both in the U.S. and Europe, maybe by 2025 or so, 24, 25. Maybe for intractable depression or other conditions.
Yeah, one form of psilocybin has been approved by the DEA, and there's some inroads being made towards insurance paying for it. I think it's called Spravato.
Well, Spravato, that's ketamine, I think.
Is that ketamine?
Ketamine? That's ketamine. Spravato, I think, is ketamine that has been approved. Ketamine, obviously, is a drug that can be psychedelic, and that is now being used by therapists. It's also more and more ketamine clinics popping up all around the U.S. and around the world to help people dealing with intractable depression and sometimes with pain. So I think Richard, if somebody had said to either one of us 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that in 2023, there would be psychedelic research centers at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, NYU Langone, Johns Hopkins, UC Berkeley, I think UCSF, UCLA, and Baylor, and I think University of Alabama, and Florida, and University College London, and a host of other places, you would have thought we were smoking something, right? But it's really been astounding. And then the other issue is these decriminalization initiatives that Oregon pioneered in 2020, the decriminalization of psychedelics, which was on the ballot at the same time with another Oregon initiative, which was really led by my successors at Drug Policy Alliance on all drug decrim. I mean, they pioneered in Oregon, then Colorado improved on the Oregon initiative and narrowly passed that one just a few months ago in late 2022. I think the question will be whether or not more of those initiatives can continue to pass at the state level. And then separately, you have legislative efforts to open up research funding. Texas, with the push of the former governor, Rick Perry, who spoke at the MAPS conference in Denver a few weeks ago. So you have all sorts of legislative bills involving psychedelics research or maybe decrim that are moving forward and sometimes being passed by state legislatures. So that's significant. I saw in Kentucky just a month or so ago, as part of the big payout from by all the pharmaceutical companies and distributors involving the overdose crisis, that Kentucky decided that they're going to spend, I think, $40 million of their opioid settlement payout for ibogaine research. So, Kentucky supporting ibogaine research. So the world is changing. And then you look outside the U.S., where Australia, recently approved allowing physicians to prescribe psychedelics, for various mental health conditions. And that's going to be implemented slowly over the next couple of years. But, they're providing a pathway there as well. Canada's making some progress. Other places in Europe. So I'm feeling pretty optimistic. Not to say that there's not going to be a moment where the media gets tired of all these amazingly positive stories about psychedelics and psychedelic therapy, and they start reporting on the people, as was true 50 years ago, as is true today, who get hurt by their use of psychedelics. The people who, jump off a building, or the
Yeah.
people who do something really stupid,
I
or the
laugh
people
because
who have a
nobody ever really jumped. There's no evidence that anybody ever really jumped off a building, but
well,
it got into
no,
into
no,
the
Richard.
consciousness.
I think there were people who went out windows and off porches,
But not
thinking they
because
could.
of LSD. That they attributed it to LSD, but I don't think that
Well,
that it. Well,
I
we're
think
not
there
sure.
actually are some cases involving a few. I mean, they're not common, but I think there have been cases of people who were, their friends weren't
Yeah.
watching out for them. They weren't doing basic harm reduction. There's
By
a
the way,
tragic.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm 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 trying to circumvent what you pointed out the media might do and start focusing the other way. And I'm working on I'm fast tracking a book on called Psychedelics Adverse Effects, and
Uh-huh.
I want to get that information out to the public as much
Well,
as
it's important.
possible.
Look, just as we know, there are some people, oftentimes with a predisposition or maybe even an active mental illness, and who can take a high dose of psychedelics, and they don't really, I mean, on the one hand, we say we don't want people to come back to baseline. You do want people to be positively transformed in some respect by a high dose experience. On the other hand, some people are landing up worse than where they started, and it's small, but it is a risk factor.
It
When
is
you
a
have
risk
millions of
factor, and the
people.
public has a right to know. I want to ask you about
Yeah.
a tactic that I've tried recently and get your opinion
Hmm.
on it. I went to the city council in the city of Fort Bragg here, where I live part time, and I proposed that they decriminalize psychedelic plants and fungi. And then I got the idea, and at my presentation in Denver at the MAPS conference, I asked the audience to all go home to their cities and go to their city councils and propose the decriminalization of psychedelic plants and fungi, and to spread the word through emails that they're doing so. Do you think this is a
Hmm.
tactic that could get some traction, where people around the country started approaching cities and directly and making these proposals? Would that be an effective
Well,
tactic?
Rich, that has been the tactic. I mean, all this stuff started with a local, was it a referendum? I think a referendum in Denver
Oh
back
yes,
about 10 years ago. And then Oakland, I think it was, passed through the city council. And you now have cities all around the United States that have actually passed these referendums. They cannot actually legally change state law, right? And
right,
they're also very much modeled on the what were called lowest priority marijuana referendum that was pioneered in Seattle by a fellow named Dominic Holden, and then picked up in California and a lot of other places, which basically they were local referendum or initiatives that said that although we cannot change state law and local police officials are beholden to state law, we as a community are directing the local police to treat marijuana possession as a lowest priority,
right.
right? So they were not legally binding on the cops, but they sent a message. And then the psychedelics reform movement, beginning with Denver in what was it, in 2015, 16 or something like that, they pioneered applying that to psychedelics, which they called it decrim, but it's effectively, since a locality cannot decriminalize something, that's only up to a state or the feds, but to say treat it as lowest priority. So those have popped up now, I think, in dozens of cities around the country. I think it is important. It demonstrates local support. It puts the issue out there. It gets it in the media. Uh, it's I think a very important technique, and I think it's what helped result in the Oregon and Colorado initiatives that passed in 2020 and 2022.
What I'm asking about, Ethan, is I'm not aware of an organized national movement. I'm aware of all these local movements that you've talked about. I'm in touch with Carlos Plazola, who, spearheaded the Oakland campaign, and he's working on a national campaign. But I don't know of any organization that is organizing a national campaign for people to spread out all over the country from
Well,
wherever they
there
live.
is.
And
I mean, I know one could, for example, take a look. There's an organization called Plant Medicine Coalition that I think was founded by Melissa Lavasani, who's based in DC. And so Plant Medicine Coalition, I think, is one of the organizations that's trying to create a national network. I think there are a few other national networks. There is the Decrim Nature movement. I think a Decrim, is it called Decrim Nature? Decrim, um, a Decrim, I'm spacing on it right now. But I mean, so there is some national effort. I do think that they are providing something in the way of models for what this legislation can look at. So I think there are resources that people can I mean, look, people can always go to a city, to the leaders in a particular city where they pass this and say, please send us what you have. But I do think this Plant Medicine Coalition group is actually providing a more national resource for that.
Thank you. I will follow up and I will contact them.
Mm-hmm.
So let's hear something about your podcast, Psychoactive.
Well, I mean, I tell you something, Richard. When I first stepped down from running DPA in the spring of 2017, 6 years ago, and people asked me like, what did I most want to do? And I wanted to take life easy at that point. I'd been working around the clock for my whole adult life, really. And but I thought a podcast would be good because, like, unlike teaching in a university or having a radio show where you have to be someplace once or twice or three times a week, I didn't want to be confined in that way. And a podcast, is you and I know, even if you don't want to call your podcast a podcast, it allows you can tape 3 or 4, put them in storage and just roll them out, even if you're off somewhere on vacation. So I thought about it. Nothing popped up. And then at the beginning of the in 2020, I think it was, right in the pandemic, I got an email from well, I'm just spacing his name right now. Oh my God, the famous movie movie director.
Give me a hint and I'll help you.
He did The Black Swan. He did Requiem of a Dream. I can't believe I'm spacing his name right now.
Not Scorsese.
Darren Aronofsky.
Okay.
So Darren Aronofsky, well-known movie director. He had already been supportive of Drug Policy Alliance. I'd known him a little bit for 20 years. And he sends me an email. Says, you want to do a podcast on psychedelics? And I say, no, I want to do one on all drugs. So he says, let's do it. And then he was about to partner with iHeartRadio, which is like the second biggest podcast platform in the world. So basically, lo and behold, we launched this podcast. I decided to call it Psychoactive. And it's basically the co-producers are iHeart and Darren Aronofsky. And we did 80 episodes in 80 weeks, starting in the summer of 2021 and concluding in the early 2023. And I mean, really everything. I mean, I'd say probably a quarter of the sessions are more about psychedelics. But we did it on the drug wars in Russia and the Philippines and Mexico and Colombia. We did it on cannabis and cannabis regulation. I interviewed historians. We did it on heroin and fentanyl. We did it on drugs like kava and kratom and khat, right? We did stuff on the overdose crisis. We did stuff on, I mean, you name it. And the politics. I had Senator Schumer on. I had the Republican Congresswoman who supports marijuana legalization, Nancy Mason. I had Nora Volkow, the head of NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, on, and grills her about what I saw as her misplaced priorities. So it was a wonderful run. And then at the end of it, iHeart said, well, we love it, but it's not on a trajectory to make us real money. So sorry. And Darren Aronofsky said, well, Ethan, let's find a way to keep doing it. And I said, you know what, at this point, I want to take a break. 80 episodes in 80 weeks. And I did a lot of prep work. If I was interviewing somebody about their book, I read the whole book. If I was interviewing, I spent days preparing. Some of them were easy, but some of them were a lot of work. So it's nice taking a break. And I'll tell you, Richard, at the conference in Denver a few weeks ago, the MAPS conference, I got so much positive feedback, including from lots of people I had never met, that it really kind of gave me a kick to say, Ethan, you really should get this thing going. So maybe later in the year. Meanwhile, I've been meaning to write a book that would be kind of part memoir, part history of the drug policy reform movement, part lessons for activists. And I got to find a way to, sit my ass down and do that.
I support you writing the book 100%. I took a break for 2 years when I stopped doing national public radio before I moved into this internet radio. I took a 2-year break. It was really nice to have a 2-year break and not
Yeah.
have to keep doing that every single week. But
Oh, tell me about.
the
Yeah.
thing that's really been the most fun and exciting for me, Ethan, is for 15 years, I had to go to a little radio studio about the size of a closet. It's a big closet. And I had to be there all the time in order to broadcast. And then when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden, it's all on the computer. And you and I, you can broadcast from anywhere in the world. I go to Wilbur Hot Springs, I broadcast. I'm staying with Jolie in a motel, I can broadcast. So
Well,
it's,
yeah, I'll
it's,
tell you this. I agree totally. The interesting thing for me was I did almost all the podcasts out of my tiny little closet in my tiny New York City apartment where I've lived for 30 years
uh-huh,
because they wanted, they say, get in your closet and, put the muffling around and that way you
that's
most
right.
create the studio like effect. So I'm literally sitting in a closet with my elbows squeezed together and this thing. And I did one episode where I went to the safe injection site up in Harlem and I did one on the road like that. And I did a few, from friends' homes, but by and large, there I was in my little closet doing this thing. And I saw that even some of the famous podcasters, what was it, Ira Glass, I think, he had a little photo of himself in, sitting in his closet. So it was nice. When the pandemic started to ease, I could have gone down to a studio, but then I'm thinking I'd rather sit in my little closet where I could
That's right.
just, go walk 6 feet instead of schlep on the subway down to some studio and have to set up there. So, I mean, if I was interviewing people live, right, with a video, then you go down to a studio. But the way we're doing it now, and you and I both use this Riverside program, which is very good, it's, I think, really easy to do it from home. Yeah,
I think we're done.
I think so. It's been really, Richard, listen, I've appreciated your friendship and having you as an ally all these many, many years. I mean, I remember going to your home. Where's your home on just on the other side of San
In
Francisco?
Tiburon, the one in
In
Tiburon?
Tiburon. I remember going to your home in Tiburon when you were hosting a fundraiser for Normal. Must have been 20 years or so ago.
At least.
And the district attorney, Terrence Hallinan, had come there for the Normal fundraiser because he wanted to show his support. But because he was the DA, he could not be seen in a room with cannabis being consumed. So I remember we had to watch out before Terrence moved from one room to another to make sure the room he was going in did not have somebody actively smoking a joint. And you think about that's what it was like when Terrence was in power, late 90s, early 2000s, and to say we've now come a long way. And part of it has been, the support and sustained commitment of people like yourself who have been out there, helping behind the scenes, helping in a public way, helping with your writing and your speaking. So I really want to thank you for all your efforts.
Well, same is true for you too, Ethan, for everything you've done. I've learned so much from you and quoted you so often over the years. And please tell Marcia the story if she has forgotten it about David.
I'm sure she has not forgotten that story.
David Murray trying to block her interview.
Yeah, my God. And no more comments need be said. And also, I should just say for people interested, the next Drug Policy Alliance conference there hasn't been one since before the pandemic. It's going to be in the Phoenix area in Arizona in October. So people should just go to the drugpolicy.org website, check it out, consider coming. That is still the leading, even though it's been surpassed in size by things like the MAPS conference, in terms of bringing the broader movement together, dealing with the whole spectrum of drug issues. It's a good place to really get immersed in that broader movement.
Yes. There was a time years ago when I was involved directly with Rob Campia. I was on the national board of the Marijuana Policy Project, where I thought there was room, or maybe good reason, to pull together the DPA and the MPP and MAPS and form, in some form a coalition. But I think that they've worked in concert to a certain extent.
Well, I'll tell you something. I mean, what I can say is that there was a moment where MPP was going through some hard times, and so
Yes.
we at Drug Policy Alliance had to consider whether or not to absorb them. And in the end, things righted themselves at MPP, and we never had to go there. But I think there's always been a good case that Marijuana Policy Project had the advantage and the disadvantage of being focused 100% on marijuana reform, right? And
Yes.
DPA had the advantage and disadvantage of advancing marijuana reform part and parcel with the broader drug policy reform objectives, right? And it made sense, I think, to have one organization that was singularly focused on the marijuana issue and another one that saw it as part of the broader drug policy reform movement. And I think with MAPS, I think Rick has done spectacularly well. The one problem with too much concentration, especially, we forget how diverse these issues can be. And in the psychedelics movement, there's always been a group of people, especially among the scientists, who really wanted to keep arm's length from the broader drug policy reform movement. But one of the things I've loved about Rick Doblin, and that's, not just our friendship, but our kind of our being allies for so long, is that Rick has always seen the psychedelics movement in two ways that I'm very supportive. The first is that he said that psychedelics reform is not just about the science. Obviously, the science is baseline and pivotal, but it's also about it's about people's individual right to use, where you and I started our conversation.
Yes.
It's about indigenous use. It's about religious uses. All of this is part of the movement, and the scientists struggle with that. And eventually they've kind of come on board. I think Rick has prevailed. And the second thing is that Rick has always seen the psychedelics movement, the psychedelics area, as part and parcel of the broader drug policy reform movement. And I think that's really central, really, really central. For example, if in fact, and it looks likely that MAPS will succeed, that once MDMA is legalized, that they stand to be the sole provider for the first 5 or 6 years, which could potentially bring in hundreds of millions of dollars into the public benefit corporation that MAPS owns, but basically for the benefit of MAPS. And MAPS has made a commitment that some portion of those funds, while most of it will focus on psychedelics reform and research and science, that some portion of those funds will go towards the broader global drug policy reform movement. And that's a major commitment for an issue-specific organization like MAPS to make. So, this I think it's been good that the organizations remain separate, but I think it's also good. We always found ways to collaborate, and even with MAPS and DPA, there was almost never any friction. With MPP, the head of it, Rob Campy, was difficult personality, and so there would be tensions and such to that. But our staff always dealt with one another. I would sit down with Rob. We would hash things out. And I think that the friction, in fact, I would say that if one compares the drug policy reform movement over its first 3 decades with the first 3 decades of the reproductive rights movement, of the gay rights movement, of the civil rights movement, I would say that we devoted fewer resources, that we wasted fewer resources on internecine conflicts than any of those bigger movements did.
I agree with you 100%. I know all of you for decades, and I agree 100%. The least infighting, and that is so positive and so important, because it's always been an enigma to me that we allow fighting on the same side of the barricades, which is it just defeats us.
Well, to me, it's never been an enigma. To me, it's been human nature. Human nature is, as I oftentimes, I would give those speeches each year at the normal conferences or other advocacy conferences, and I say, something? The people you hate the most in any movement are your allies. Your enemies, they're out there. You don't really know them. You rarely see them. But your allies, those are the ones you fight over for funding and for credit and girlfriends and boyfriends and tactics and strategies. And you're working up close, and you can really not stand some people. But our obligation as activists is to keep our eye on the prize and to make sure that doesn't get in the way. I gave a speech where I should tell you, it was a little psychedelics gathering in New York back in the fall. And the one line that people most remembered, especially the younger ones, was I said, one rule I always had for myself was there could never be more than 5 people in the entire movement who I was not on speaking terms with. It was like that max, right? And even with those 5, I always ensured that we had ways of communicating organizationally, whether by email or through our staff or colleagues, that's what it means to build a movement. You can't let the petty bullshit get in the way of accomplishing the end result and pursuing the mission.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. That's a great quote to end with. You can't let the petty bullshit get in the way of the mission, because the mission of the mission is the mission.
That's exactly right. And we've made a lot of progress, and hopefully we're going to continue to do so. I think we will.
And thank you all, listeners, for being with us on today's broadcast of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. As you know, we broadcast every week at 9 o'clock. If you want to get the newsletter that'll tell you who's going to be on the program, you can just send us an email at info@mindbodyhealthpolitics.org. Until next time, this is Dr. Richard Lewis Miller reminding you that good health is worth fighting for, and it's essential for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
You're listening to